during the presentation, and then what we'll do is when it's time for the Q&A, we'll just unmute you. So if you do have any questions, if you can either just raise your hand like this, or you can use the little emoji symbol to raise your hand and let us know. You can also put any comments or questions in the chat as well, and we'll try and make sure that we pick those up as we go along. So the presentation is in a couple of sections, so I'm going to break after each one just to break it up a bit and allow you guys to ask any questions that you've got as we go along. So we'll let you know when we get to those bits. So to introduce myself and the organisation, so I'm the founder of Cyclists, which is an organisation aiming to inspire Muslim women to cycle, and we have groups at the moment in Waltham Forest and Chingford. Sorry, Waltham Forest we've got two, we've got Walthamstow and Chingford. We also have a group in Redbridge, and we're planning groups in Hackney and in Hounslow, and hopefully in South London as well. So in normal times, prior to COVID-19, we ran regular rides for Muslim women in these areas, but also our rides are open for all women and any women who want to come and attend as well. So if you are based in any of those areas, then do check out our website, cyclesisters.org.uk, and you can have a look and find out more about when our rides take place once we get up and running again. So we've been put this session together today because we know that during the lockdown more people have started cycling, which has been really fantastic to see, and particularly seeing lots more families out on bikes as well. And we do get lots of questions about how can you manage being out on your bikes with your kids and cycling with them together in a way that's safe. So we put together this presentation to try and help answer some of these questions and to go through the basics with you. So I'm going to share my screen now and start doing the presentation. So give me 1 second. Okay, so this is me and my family, and I've got 3 children. I've got an 8-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a nearly 2-year-old. And as you can see, they're all at different stages of cycling. I've got my 8-year-old who rides on the roads with me. My 4-year-old has just learned how to pedal during lockdown, but she's mostly riding on the pavement. In the photo there, she's being towed by my bike with a follow me attachment. So that means she can be on the roads with us, but I'm controlling her bike. She's not quite, I wouldn't trust her to be on the roads at the moment. And then my 2-year-old is on my bike. So we're constantly adapting how we ride together as a family as the kids' skills are developing and they're growing in confidence. So I'm going to be sharing some of my experiences of riding with my family as I talk to you today. I'm also a qualified bikeability instructor, so I work mainly in Waltham Forest and Redbridge, and I mainly teach adults, but I do also teach children outside of the school setting and family groups as well. So the first section that we're going to be covering is about preparation, so getting ready to take your children on the roads, and the first part of that is assessing whether your child is ready. So this is the basic first question that comes up is, when can children cycle on the roads? So there's a couple of areas that you need to consider, and the first part of that is assessing their cycling skills and making sure that they're competent. So if you've heard of bikeability, bikeability is what used to be called cycling proficiency, and it's the national curriculum for cycling, which is what's taught in schools, but it's also the same curriculum is taught to adults as well through one-to-one and small group sessions. So bikeability is organised into 3 levels, and the first level is your basic cycling skills, and that takes place in an off-road setting. So what I would recommend you to do is to go through this small checklist of skills that are part of the level 1 and make sure that your child is confident with all of them. So the first thing is, can they start the bike by setting their pedal? And in a minute I'm going to show you a really short video so you'll be able to have a look and see what I mean by that. But start confidently by setting the pedal, balancing as they're cycling along, being able to steer with control, so that means making the bike go exactly where they want it to go. Can they brake safely? So not just being able to come to a stop, but also can they use their brakes to control their speed? And when they're cycling along, should be covering brakes, both brakes with 2 fingers as well. Are they able to use their gears? So this is not necessarily an essential skill for riding on the roads, and actually some of the kids' bikes don't have gears anyway. But if your child is able to, if the bike does have gears, then it's going to make their cycling a lot easier if they know how to use them. Are they able to look behind? So that means looking over looking over your shoulders. So both shoulders, right shoulder and left shoulder. And are they able to take one hand off the bike and signal? So putting your arm out to the side without losing control. So I think it's much easier if you can actually see these skills in action. So I'm just going to show you a very short video. It's just about 1.5 minutes from Bikeability, which shows children demonstrating these skills. It's possible you may not be able to hear it properly, but it doesn't matter because there's no words, it's just music, and the words come up on the screen, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so just give me 1 second. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a good idea about what, oh, sorry, 1 second. Okay, so that's the kind of core level 1 skills that you'd be looking for to feel confident that your child had the cycling skills that they needed to be on the roads. But obviously you also need to make sure that your skills are up to scratch as well. So you don't need to be a super confident cyclist to start cycling with your children, but you do need to have, you do need to have a certain degree of competence. And the best thing that I would recommend is that you take bikeability lessons yourself. So I'm going to be covering some of the basics today, but really, it's not replacing actually going out and having a lesson with a real life instructor and being able to practice things and get feedback from the instructor on areas that you perhaps need to work on as well. So unfortunately, at the moment, the cycle training is all suspended due to COVID-19, but hopefully it should be getting up and running again fairly soon. So keep an eye on your council websites and look out for when you can book that training again. You can also book a family training session as well, by the way, so you could choose to book a lesson with yourself and your kids, and the instructor will work with you together as a group. The other area to think about is your child's maturity, and personality and character, I think, comes into this quite a bit. So there isn't actually any minimum legal age when your child can go on the roads. So it is a decision for the parents or guardians to decide when they think that their child is ready. Couple of things to consider is, do they listen to what they're being told to do? Like, are they able to follow instructions that you're going to give them on the road? Obviously, that's critical, that they're going to be responsive to that. Are they aware of the traffic? Do they understand the potential dangers of the traffic? And do they have a basic idea of not necessarily knowing all the rules of the road, but there are certain basics that you need to understand. So things like, when do you need to stop? So understanding what are junctions, what are roundabouts, what side of the road do you need to ride on. So all of these are kind of basic things that you could be teaching your children, but roughly that kind of awareness develops somewhere between the ages of 8 and 10. It's also helpful if they know their left and their right. If you're giving them instruction to go one way and they end up heading the other way, obviously that could end up in a bad situation. So to give you an indication, bikeability starts being taught in schools from year 5. So that's when children are around about 9 or 10. So I would say roughly you're looking at somewhere between 8 and 10. It may be older for some children. It may possibly be a little bit younger for some children, but that will depend on your child, and it also depend on you and your confidence to take them as well. So really you're the best judge of that, and you know your children the best, and you can make that decision when you think that they're ready. If your child isn't quite ready to cycle on the roads, then it doesn't mean that you can't cycle together as a family, because there are other options. So depending on the age of your child, you've got options like tow bars, like you saw in that photo of me and my daughter at the beginning. You've also got options like trailers and child seats that can be attached to your bike as well. So I've put a link to a video there if anyone is interested, where we did another session on cycling with young children. So these are all different options for carrying children on bikes and children that are not quite ready to ride. And obviously, of course, you've got the pavement, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So once you've decided that your child is ready to cycle on the roads, then the next thing to think about is their bike, and making sure that their bike is set up correctly and is safe to use. So you need to check the saddle height. When your child and you are sitting on your saddles, you need to be able to put your feet down on both sides, where you're lifting up the heel. You're not completely flat-footed. You're lifting up your heels, so the balls of your feet are on the floor. You can lift up the saddle by, often you just need a set of Allen keys. Some seat posts are adjusted by a quick release lever, so you can just open that and you can easily adjust the saddle, or you might need a spanner. But a word of warning is, when you are adjusting the seat post, make sure that you don't go above a little line called minimum insert line, because you have to have a certain amount of the seat post in the tube for the saddle to be secure. And often with kids, because they're growing so quickly, you often see the parents lifting the saddles higher and higher, and it's reached that limit and it's actually at a point where it's not safe, and the child is ready at that point for the next bike. So that's just something to look out for. The other thing to consider is the reach of the brakes. So as I mentioned, it's really important when you're cycling along to have 2 fingers over your brakes like this. So in our family, we call them bunny ears, because the kids like that and it helps them to remember. So you always have your 2 fingers over your brakes so that you're ready to brake at any time, and it makes your response time much quicker, rather than having it on your handlebars like this and then having to move your fingers to your brakes. So sometimes we see bikes set up where actually the kids can't reach the brakes because they're too far down. So again, those can be adjusted just using a set of Allen keys, and that's quite a quick thing to do. You could have a look on YouTube if you're not sure how to adjust that. So that's 2 things in terms of the fit of the bike. Then you need to do a basic bike check to check that the bike is safe to ride. So this is a quick 30-second check that you do each time before you head out on the bikes. And there's 4 things to check, and helpfully you can remember them as A, B, C, D, so you remember each of the things. So I'm not going to go through that now, but I have put a link to a short YouTube video there, which shows somebody demonstrating how to do that check, which is a really good short video and advice on how to do that. So check that out afterwards when you get a chance. Then you need to check clothing. So with helmets, just to say that helmets are not legally required in the UK. It is a matter of personal choice. But if you are going to get your children to wear a helmet, then it's really important to make sure that it fits properly. And the picture there shows the correct setup of the helmet. So you can see that the straps of the helmet are forming a V shape each side of his ears. And then in terms of the actual fit of the helmet around here, it shouldn't be wobbly. You've got like a little dial usually on most helmets that you can turn at the back just to adjust the fit round the head. And then you should be able to put 2 fingers only underneath the strap under the chin, and 2 fingers between the eyebrows and the top of the helmet. So that's the correct setup for a helmet. So check that, because if the helmet is just perched on the top of the head, then it's not going to do much if they fall off. With their clothing, so you're checking that there's no bits that are hanging down that could get caught. So you don't want anything to get caught in the chain, caught in the brakes, or under the pedals. So you're looking for things like shoelaces, making sure that they're tied up tightly, or you know, better if your kids have got shoes with Velcro, then that makes it easier. Think about things like like toggles on coats, scarves during winter, anything that's potentially to get caught. Just make sure it's all tucked in. Then once you've sorted the bike, you've sorted the clothing, then you want to be thinking about your journey. So what sort of journey are you going to be doing when you first start out cycling with your kids on the road? So definitely start with something short and something small. Just take it nice and easy in the beginning to get your child used to riding on the roads and get you used to riding with them together. You could just do a very short 5-minute ride around the roads that are close to you if they're nice and quiet. So start small, build it up, think about the route in terms of your child's ability, and you know, the more you cycle with them on the roads, that ability is going to develop and you'll be able to try out more challenging routes. But in the beginning, you know, you're probably going to be wanting to avoid busy roads, big main junctions, unless you know that there's a way, you know, you have to plan how you would deal with that junction. So maybe there's a crossing that you could get off your bikes and you could include that as part of your route, because you've got a way to manage that. I said about possibly avoiding hills. I think it depends on your child and what they're like. My son is quite a moany cyclist, so I generally try to avoid any kind of hills, and we just go for completely flat routes as far as possible, because he just enjoys it a lot more. It's good if you know the route that you're going to be using with your child. So if you had time, you could ride it in advance without your child, or it may be a route that you use anyway and you're familiar with it. So you know what's coming up, you know what to expect. There's not going to be any kind of surprises on the way, and that's kind of a helpful approach, especially when you're first starting out. And then it's making sure you've got everything that you need. So you know, when you're out cycling, obviously the weather can change, it can be unpredictable, so you need to be prepared for all situations that might arise. You know, when you're going anywhere with kids, it obviously inevitably involves taking a load of stuff, but maybe there's a couple of extra things you'd consider when you're going for a bike ride. So I consider a water bottle for on your kid's bike, because again, this is like from cycling with my son, he likes to stop pretty often to have water. He's saying that he's hot and he's tired, so he wants to have a break, and it just, if you've got the water bottle on the kid's bike, it just makes it a lot easier. They can just quickly get their water rather than you having to faff around with your rucksack or your pannier bag getting the water out all the time. Obviously at the moment, hand sanitizer, wipes are useful to have with you, waterproof jackets, and sun cream. You know, you never know what's going to happen. Make sure you've got your bike locks if you're going to be stopping somewhere, and basic tools as well. So if you're not confident with doing things like fixing a puncture, then possibly think about signing up for a bike maintenance course. You can do a basic course which covers things like punctures and adjusting your brakes and things that might come up on a ride. So the council used to run some free courses if you're based in Waltham Forest. Other councils may do similar things, so you can look out for that. There's also lots of brilliant YouTube videos out there as well, if you want to look at any of those particular areas. I'd also really recommend, before you head out on the roads with your child, to think about what the rules of your ride together are going to be, and to discuss that in advance with them, so that there's, you know, you've got shared expectations and understanding of how you want things to work when you're out on the ride. So you're going to be talking about what order you're going to ride in as a group, and that's something we're going to come on to talk about in a minute. Make sure that they're clear that you're going to be staying together as a group, so you don't want anyone racing off in front. So when you ride along, you're going to be trying to keep a bike distance between you and the person in front. Obviously no tricks or stunts. You don't want any wheelies or riding with no hands. Both hands need to be on the handlebars at all times unless you're signalling. Make sure they understand that they need to follow your instructions. It'd be good to talk about what will happen at junctions. That's something we're going to go through in a little bit. What your child should do if they need to stop. You don't want them slamming on the brakes and just stopping right in front of you, so everyone goes in the back of them. So it's good if you discuss that in advance. And there's, so, you know, kids are going to be familiar with social distancing now, but there may be a few things that are a bit different when you're out on a bike ride. And that's something we're going to cover a little bit later as well. So I think at this point, I'm just going to stop for a few minutes and just see if anyone's got any questions on anything that we've covered so far. And then in our next section, we're going to go on to talking about actually cycling on the roads. So we'll be covering things like positioning and group order and junctions and that kind of thing. So is there anyone who wanted to ask anything now about assessing whether your child is ready for riding, or the other things that you consider when you're preparing for going out on the roads? No? We can keep going then, and we'll, if anything occurs to you, then feel free to either put it in the chat, or we'll stop again after the next bit to take any more questions. Okay, so the next bit then is how you would go about actually cycling on the roads together. So in bikeability, there's it's what's called the 4 core functions. These are like, say, like the takeaway points from the bikeability curriculum. So whether you do level 1, 2, or 3, these are the points that we would want you to come away with and to apply to any cycling that you're going to be doing. So the 4 things are looking. So this is making observations, not just what's in front of you, but being aware of what's all around you. So you're going to be doing regular checks over your right shoulder, which is the traffic shoulder. So looking behind you and getting a really good look of what's going on. Often people just do a little glance and are not really taking in what's happening. You're going to be looking over your left shoulder when you're pulling into the left, or when you're going to be making a left turn. So it's one of the things, even people who are very experienced cyclists, they don't do enough, is doing those checks. The next thing is position. So do you understand what the different positions are and when to use them? Communication, being able to communicate clearly to other road users, and different ways that we do that as cyclists. So, you know, most people will be familiar with the idea of signaling and putting your arm out to the side, but also your position that you take up communicates things to other road users. And you can also use your eye contact as well. That's a very important tool that we have as cyclists. Prioritization, so this is understanding who goes first, what happens at junctions, what happens at roundabouts, when you need to give way, when it's your right of way, and so on. So I would really recommend that you can start introducing these ideas and these functions as soon as your child starts riding a bike. So even if you've got a child who's riding on the pavement, you can still start talking about these. So they may not understand some of the words like the priorities, but you can still explain, you know, for example, like you're on the pavement, this is a shared space between pedestrians and cyclists. So if you've got pedestrians who are there, then sometimes you might need to move to the side and give way to pedestrians. You know, in terms of communicating, make sure they understand how to use their bells to notify other pedestrians that they're there, using their voices, excuse me. You know, all these kind of things is starting to get your child ready to thinking about what they're going to have to be doing when they're on the roads, and it just starts to build up those skills from an early stage. So in terms of positioning, there's 2 positions, and if you've done any bikeability training, then this will be familiar to you. So the secondary and primary position. The secondary position is what's demonstrated on the picture on the left. So this is where you take up a position to the left of the flow of the traffic. So you are a big step away from the curb. So you never ride right up alongside the curb, because that's not a safe place to be, both in terms of you get, you know, all the debris and bits of glass and things like that along the curb, as well as drains which can be slippy, but also you're not visible to other road users when you're right up against the curb like that. So it's a big step, or around about half a metre to a metre away from the curb, and that position is what you would take up normally on a road which is wider, because with that position you're communicating that you're happy to be overtaken from behind, because there's space for other vehicles to do so. Where there's a situation where you don't want to be overtaken from behind because the road is narrower and there's not space for anyone to safely do that, you're going to take up primary position, which is the picture which is on the right. So primary position is where you take the lane. So it's as if you're any other vehicle, you're taking up the full space of the lane by positioning yourself right in the middle of it. So no other vehicle can overtake you in that lane because you are right there. So that's the position that you take up when you don't want to be overtaken. So it's for narrow roads, it's for roads where you've got double parked cars, and also where you've got pinch points, so where the road narrows and you wouldn't want a vehicle to be going through that at the same time as you. But a note on so primary, you don't want to be using primary position on a busy, wide, fast-flowing road because you're just going to be unnecessarily blocking up the traffic. So it's important to understand when you would use these two different positions. So one thing when thinking about positioning to be aware of is the car doors. So if you haven't done the bike buddies training, you may not have thought about this before, but car doors are actually quite big. And if you look at them and see how far out into the road they go, if someone was to open them, you know, you have to be quite far away from the car to avoid being hit by it. And it is one of the most common causes of accidents in cyclists, is the driver just quickly opening their door and not looking and not checking before and going into a cyclist in a very painful way to get knocked off your bike. So you need to remember to be outside of what we call the car door zone, and leave a little bit extra space as well. So what that means, if, for example, you have a road like this, which again, if you're based in Waltham Forest, which I think a lot of you are, these are really common kind of roads that we have everywhere, where you've got double parked cars on both sides. If we were cycling to the left of the lane, we would be in the car door zone. We would be too close to those car doors. So we need to be in our primary position in a road like this, where we're right in the middle of the lane, so we're away from the car doors on both sides. So we're going to come on to group order now. So again, this is one of the really common questions that comes up, is where should you position your children to ride with you on the roads? So if you have two adults in the group with you, then you would put your children in the middle of the adults. So you'd have an adult at the front and an adult at the back, and your children in between you. So you're providing protection for your children at the front and the back. And if you've got a setup like this, you don't necessarily need your children to signal. So I would always recommend that your children do try and signal, because it's good for them to practice and develop those skills. But if you've got someone at the front of the group and the back of the group signaling, and you stay together as a group and you're quite tight as a unit, then you don't need to necessarily have your children signaling. Obviously, sometimes we don't have two adults, there's only one of us who's taking our kids out. So if that's the situation, then you're going to put the adult at the back and your children are going to be in front of you. So if you've got more than one child, so if you had two children, you would put your most competent child at the front and your less competent child in the middle, and then you at the back. If you've got a older child who is, you know, quite a skilled cyclist, to the extent of you don't really need to worry about what they're doing, you're confident that they're able to make their own decisions, then you could put them behind you potentially, and you could then focus on the child who's in front of you. But other than that, I wouldn't recommend putting children behind you. So then you do need to think, if you've got more than two children, you do need to think about whether it's a good idea to ride on the roads together, and it totally depends on your route, and it will depend on your confidence and on the skills of your children. And it may be, if you've got more than three children, more than two children, that you're carrying them in different ways, like you might have one who's actually on your bike. But if they're all going to be on the roads and riding independently, then that's just something to think about. So the reasons that we recommend to have your children in front of you, the first thing is that you can obviously see what they're doing. So when they're behind you, you're focusing on what's happening in front of you, and you can't constantly be looking back and seeing what they're doing behind you. You also, when they're in front of you, you can see the situation that they're facing, and you can start to see how they respond to situations as well. And if you're thinking about trying to develop your child's skills so that eventually they can cycle independently without you being there, you're going to want to feel confident that you know that they know what they're doing and that they know how to deal with different situations. So that gives you an opportunity to observe them and to see what they do. If they're in front of you, they can hear your instructions much more clearly. So if they're behind, you're talking that, your voice carries this way, and it's really difficult to hear somebody if you're behind them. So if they're in front, then it's much easier for them to hear what you want them to do. Also, by being behind, so if you see the picture that's on the top there on the right, with the adult is the one in the blue, if you can see how the adult has moved out a little bit to the right to create space for the children. So say for example you want to, you know, there's a pinch point coming up ahead. Your child might not know or might not immediately think to move into primary position, to take the lane, to create the space for themselves to go through that pinch point without any vehicle going through. But the adult at the back can anticipate, look over their right shoulder, check that it's safe to do so, move out to the right, and then create space, and then say to your child, right, you move out to the right now into primary position, and we can go through this pinch point together. And then the last point was what I mentioned before about developing independence and developing their skills to be able to deal with situations. The other option that you have is cycling with your children side by side. So the picture at the bottom shows that. So it's legal in the UK to cycle two abreast. Not all drivers know that that's legal, so you might get some potential negativity from drivers who feel irritated when they see two cyclists like that together and feel like they're taking up all the space. You need to be sensible about it. Sometimes you might need to go back into single file if you're you know, becoming a sort of roadblock and there's a big queue of traffic forming behind you. It really depends on the width of the road and what's suitable, but it is an option for cycling with your children in that way. And sometimes I do ride with my 8-year-old like that. You know, it's nice because you're actually riding along together, you can have a conversation, and you know, you're also on busier roads. It might be a good option because you're protecting your child from the traffic, because you take up the position on the right and you have your child on the left of you. It's not suitable for those kind of roads that I showed you a minute ago like this, because you're by cycling side by side, both of you are going to be in the car door zone. So that kind of road is too narrow to cycle like that. So cycling on the pavement. So this is a real grey area because it is technically illegal to cycle on the pavement for everybody, including for children. But there is a shared kind of understanding that children are going to have to cycle on the pavement, especially younger children. And there's no criminal liability for children who are under the age of 10. So nothing would happen to your child cycling on the pavement. But for older children and for you as an adult, if you could potentially face a fine, I think it's something like £70 or £75, if somebody stopped you for cycling on the pavement. So it's something to consider. If there's situations where I feel like I do need to be on the pavement with my children, then I will just get off my bike and I'll push my bike. So I'm not actually riding on it. You know, I think you just need to be about it. And if it's busy with pedestrians, you know, you're not going to cycle on your bike on the with your bike on the pavement. But you know, really understand that, especially where you've got children of different ages and you've got mixed abilities, you need to be able to use the pavement as well as the road at times to be able to make your cycling work for your family. Okay, so passing vehicles and side roads. So when you need to do anything, think back to those 4 core functions, the bikeability 4 core functions. So looking, positioning, communicating, and priority. So if you're going to be passing a parked vehicle, then you would first of all be anticipating before your child reaches it, and you're going to check behind your shoulder. So that's the looking behind on the traffic side, seeing, is it safe for me to move my position out into primary position? Move into primary position, and you're creating that space for your child. You give them the instruction to then move out into primary position as well, and then you can pass the vehicle, and then you check your left shoulder, and then you're going to move back in. So you would also do a similar thing to this for pinch points as well. So any time that you need to change your position to pass something, you know, so side roads as well would be something where you'd also want to do this. And it's about just thinking in advance and making sure that you look before you move. At junctions, we'd recommend that you cycle up to the junction with your child, so you don't just leave them at the junction with you behind and leave it for them to decide when it's safe to go. You may reach that point at some point with your child, but certainly not in the beginning when you're starting out cycling together. So you would just come up past your children and you would wait at the junction line with them. You can then have a look both ways and check that it's clear before you give the instruction for them to pull away. As you pull away from the junction, you might do that side by side, so 2 abreast together. You make the turn together, and then maybe you drop back behind after them. behind them once you're clear from the junction. All junctions should be taken in primary position. So before you move into that position, again, it's thinking about looking, checking behind your shoulder, making sure that it's safe to move, signaling if you need to, that's the communicating part of it, changing your position and understanding what happens at the junction. So who has the right of way and who has the priority. So in the picture that you can see there, the cyclists are on the minor road. So obviously they need to give way to any traffic that's on the major road before they pull away. So a couple of just extra tips and a few points about cycling together. So as I mentioned before, I think it's good if you can encourage your child to look behind them regularly and signal so that they start to build up and develop those skills. Make sure that you give clear and concise instructions throughout. So try not to be confusing about what you want your child to do. And where possible, I think it's good if you can really briefly explain to your child why you gave the instruction. So make sure they understand, why are you saying don't ride too close to the cars? So they understand, well, if the car door open, I'm going to get knocked off my bike. Why do you have to look behind you when you approach a junction? Well, it's because I need to see if there's anything coming, so I'm safe to move out into primary position, and I know if I need to signal to anyone. So this kind of feedback and understanding is part of developing your child's skills for riding on the roads and part of that process of developing their independent judgment and decision making. Don't be discouraged if sometimes you have to get off your bikes. So, there might be a hill that was part of your route, or you come up to a junction where it just feels too busy, you don't feel confident taking your child through on the bike. It's fine, like you get off the bikes, that's an option that we have for us as cyclists. It's really flexible, we can just jump on the pavement, get off our bikes, walk, go across the crossing or walk up the hill and then get back on again. I think it's good having a very kind of flexible approach when you're out riding together. Sometimes you might be on the road, sometimes you might need to jump onto the pavement, sometimes you're going to be on cycle lanes. It's going to depend on your route and depend on your journey. Being aware of your child's mood. So your child may be most of the time very competent riding on the roads and you feel confident with that, but sometimes if they're in a bad mood, they might start doing things that are a bit silly, and you might feel actually you just need to go home. So that happened to me the other day with my son. He got in a grump because we were going a different way to the way he wanted to go. And he refused to cycle in front of me. He was just cycling behind me and really messing around. So I was like, right, yeah, get back on the pavement for now. And then we just found the quickest way back home and we just went home and called it a day. And overall, make sure that, we want to be encouraging. We want our children to enjoy cycling. We don't want it to become a chore. So try to be as positive as possible and encouraging that they're doing really well and they're learning new skills, and give them feedback on that. So after the ride, giving positive feedback. If there's any kind of key points that you think that would be good for them to work on, you can mention that. And making sure that they understand why you gave the instructions. I do think it's better to do that when you're actually on the ride so that they can understand it in context, but it might be that there's something in particular you wanted to go through with them afterwards as well. And it's all about trying to get them to enjoy cycling, love cycling, and for them to develop their skills so that ultimately they're able to cycle by themselves in the future. Okay, so we'll take a little break from the presentation now and see if there's any questions. So would anyone like to start with a question? I can see there's a question in the chat, so I can have a read of that. But in the meantime, is there anyone who wanted to ask anything?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, Pareen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you.
I was just going to ask, you mentioned about helping your child sort of understand some of the basic rules of the road. I was wondering if there's a kind of website or any resources that you could recommend where they could just maybe look at like stop signs, the give way signs and so on, and where they can...
Yeah, that's a really good question. So At the end of the presentation, there's a slide with some recommendations of resources. So one of the best places is the Bikeability website itself, and they've actually produced a lot more resources during lockdown now, which is brilliant. So they're recognizing that more families are needing to have those resources to be able to get out with their kids. So there's a series of videos on there which are really, so you saw the one at the beginning which was about the off-road cycling skills, but they go through each stage that you would do in a bikeability lesson. They've made a short video about it, and then they've also made a parent's handbook as well. So that will go through some of the things that you mentioned. I don't know, I haven't seen anything, or I haven't personally come across anything in terms of road signs and things like that. I mean, I'm sure there are websites out there where you could find that kind of thing. But you know, I think also you can be the teacher as well of your children. So when you're out on the road cycling together and you see a road sign, you can just explain to your child what it is and what it means, and they'll start to develop their understanding of that. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes, it does. I'll check out the website.
So yeah, just reading Mel's comment on the chat. So yeah, completely understand where you're coming from with that. And there are, you know, there are certain roads and certain areas where, you know, you really might just not feel confident on the roads. So it's fine to use the pavements in that way, in that kind of flexible way. I think it's just being aware of you as an adult on the pavement. It would be better to get off and walk if possible. And trying to find routes as well. So when it comes to routes, I think this is also can be quite a barrier for people, not knowing where to cycle with your kids. So you can try a couple of things. You can try using specific cycle planning apps. So there's one that I use which is called Cycle Streets, and it just works like any kind of route planning navigation tool where you put in 2 postcodes or your start or your end point, and it comes up with a suggested cycle route. And it gives you the option where you can choose between the quiet route, balanced route, or the most direct route. So the quiet route is going to be the one which is using, you know, mostly back roads. It's using cycle infrastructure like the cycle lanes wherever it's present. And through doing that, I really discovered a whole new world that I didn't, you know, as a driver, I just wasn't aware that it was there. So when I first started cycling, I would just use the main roads and I would just go whichever way I would have driven there, that's the way I'd go on my bike, because I didn't know any different. But from cycling more and like using these kind of route planning and just trying out different back streets, then I really realized that there's so many different options for ways of getting around. And when I'm with my children, then I will always choose those quieter, easier routes, even if it takes us longer to get there, because it's just much more enjoyable. You don't have to feel stressed about the traffic and managing those sort of really busy roads. There's also, I think the enjoyable, if you're in Waltham, I think, is everyone in Waltham Forest? If you're not in Waltham Forest, you could maybe just mention on the chat, but Waltham Forest has got a website specifically for cycling and walking called Enjoy Waltham Forest, and they've got suggested routes on there as well. So you can have a look on there and see if there's routes that would work for you. And the other thing as well that you can try is joining a cycle group. So once the rides get up and running again, then there's a number of groups in the borough that do run rides for families. And that's a great way to start cycling as a family even. So if you don't feel confident to start just with you and your kids, you could take your kids to a ride like that, cycle together as a group where you've got ride leaders, get to know some new routes as well, and that could be a good way to get you going.
Great advice, thank you.
No problem. So Mel, sorry, Steph has asked a question about mirrors. So yeah, so you can get mirrors to go on your bike. I've not tried it personally, but I know that it can be good, particularly if you've got mobility issues, because some people really do find it difficult to turn their head enough. When we do the bikeability training, and this is, I can't remember if this was in the video, I think it was actually. So when you're cycling and you want to see whether your child is looking over their shoulder enough, or you're looking over your shoulder enough, get someone to cycle behind them and then ask them to look over each shoulder and hold up fingers, like a number of fingers, and get them to shout it out. and see, can they even see your fingers, and can they count how many fingers? And in the beginning, what you find is that a lot of people are not able to look properly. They're sort of more looking over there rather than looking right behind them. And it takes a little bit of time to get to develop the skill of actually being able to really look behind you. And I think also to, you know, stretch the muscles in your neck as well if you've not been doing that. Now I surprise myself, I can really like almost turn my head like the whole way around, and I can see really clearly because I do it a lot. But you do get people who you know, really struggle with it. So mirrors could be good in that option. And you know, it could be something that you want to try with your son if he is finding it difficult looking over his shoulder. But I guess it's getting used to how those mirrors work and making sure you haven't got any blind spots or anything like that. So practicing in an off-road environment would be a good idea before you head out on the roads. Okay, so another question from Jane. If Jane, actually, do you want to just ask your question rather than me reading it? Do you want to come off mute?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. We live very close to Copper Mill Lanes, which is great to get to the marshes and the wetlands and things. And my son is only 4. He's pretty good for a 4-year-old, but yeah, Copper Mill Lane has a bike route on it, but it's on the road. So and the sign's up saying, you know, cars should not overtake cyclists, but they do anyway. And at the moment, obviously with lockdown, it's very busy around there. The pavement's tiny and it's full of pedestrians. So kind of being on the road seems the most efficient way to get down Copper Mill Lane to the marshes. But I'm now listening to what you said, I can see he's definitely not ready to be on the road more generally. But I'm wondering whether it would still be, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I'm being really silly by letting, because twice we've gone down there and I've let him ride on the road. And he's been really sensible and really cautious, but you know, I don't know whether I should be doing that or not, even though there's pictures of bikes on the road.
Yeah, well, it is really challenging, especially with the social distancing and trying to, you know, when you got your kids on the pavement, you can't avoid passing people really closely. So I know where you're talking about. So, you know, it has to come down to you and your confidence in your child particularly to respond to instructions and to be able to understand what they need to do. So at that age, they probably don't know their left from their right. And because I'm just thinking my daughter's also 4 and I'm just thinking about her. If I tell her, you know, pull into the left because there's something coming, I'm not sure whether she will head out into the middle of the road or not. But saying that, I do sometimes put her on the road. And I have, you know, she's only started pedaling during the lockdown, and sometimes where the pavements are busy, I do put her in front of me on the road for a short stretch, and then I'll get her back on the pavement again once it feels that the pavement is a bit more empty. But it depends on how much traffic is around. You know, the other thing about children at that age is that they're small and they're out of the lines of sight of drivers, so that's just something to be aware of. You know, they could be in the blind spot of drivers because they're sort of down below the bonnet of a car, or especially like where you've got the high-rise cab things in those big trucks. So that's something to consider as well. On a road like Copper Mill Lane, it's not that busy depending on the time of day, I guess, but you do get the big trucks. You've got the industrial estate traffic that's coming up and down. So it would probably depend on the time of day. And the other thing to say as well is to don't let markings on the road kind of lull you into a sense of security in terms of like proper cycle infrastructure. Like a proper cycle lane is where it's fully segregated from the road. And it's segregated from the pavement as well. So on that kind of a cycle lane, you could feel confident with your child. Where you've got just pictures of bikes on the road, it's not offering you any kind of protection at all from the traffic. So yeah, it doesn't mean don't do it. You know, you could do it, and I do it sometimes with my 4-year-old, but just think about the situation and the time of the day and those kind of things, and you know, work with your child to develop their understanding and you know, what to do. Because also I think at a younger age as well, children can panic when they see cars. I definitely remember my son doing that, and at that point I was like, no, actually he's really not ready, because as soon as he sees a car, he's like gets up, you know, runs to the side, and it's not safe to do that because he's not checking, he's not looking when he's pulling in. Whereas now, you know, a year or two on, he's now confident. If there's an oncoming car, he knows what to do, and he's not just gonna you know, he's not just gonna suddenly stop or pull out the way. So yeah, there's a couple of things to think about there. Hopefully there's a few points that
thank you very much. Can I just very quickly then, you said about segregated bike paths, I'm just thinking of one on Lee Bridge Road, which is lovely.
Yeah.
Like, but there's obviously lots of junctions to minor roads. Would you put your 4-year-old on a bike path like that? Or
so I think what I would do is I probably would, if I had my son as well, because I would have him in front of her. So we would be as a group together, because yeah, those kind of things again are tricky, because it gives you the impression, well, you know, you do have the right of way actually, but that doesn't mean that you get, you know, you're not going to get drivers who are not properly looking and pull in and out of those junctions. So talking in advance with your children, you know, this is again, you know, I was saying about the 4 core functions and starting to introduce them, like from as soon as your child starts riding a bike. When they're cycling on the pavement, make sure they understand when they have to stop. So what is a side road? What is a driveway, you know, where you might have cars coming in and out? Once they start to get this in their head, then they start to become more aware. They're not just being oblivious and just cycling. So be aware that there will be side roads, what they are. Start slowing down as you approach it. As the adult, you're looking around, you're seeing, you know, looking behind, checking, is there anyone that might be about to pull in left from behind you? Is there anyone who's turning right from the major road? And be ready to give the instruction to your child to stop. If you feel you can trust your child to do that and to stop when you tell them to stop, then, you know, you're fine. That's okay. But if your child isn't going to listen, then it becomes a bit difficult. But when I've got my oldest son, he then is the front of the group, so you know, I completely trust him to stop, so he will be stopping and she will have to stop because she's behind him. So in that way I probably feel a bit more secure. But it really depends on your child, and it depends on the roads as well, and the time of day and things like that.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
No worries, that's fine. There's a message from, I've got a message from Steph, but I can't actually read it. It's not coming up properly. Steph, did you want to ask your question?
Oh no, mine was the mirrors question. You've done that one. Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. Okay.
Thanks.
I'm going to, are there any more questions for now? I'm just going to quickly finish off the last section then, and then we can have more time for questions after that. So the next bit is about socially distancing when you're riding, and about teaching your child to ride a bike, if that's relevant for you. I'm going to cover that really quickly. When you're cycling at the moment and you're trying to maintain social distancing, these are a couple of tips of things to do. So the first thing is keeping distance between yourself and other cyclists and pedestrians. So I wrote this before the advice changed this week, but I think the advice is still 2 meters where you can. So thinking about, you know, when you're alongside a pavement, especially if you're in secondary position, which is the one that's closer to the curb, and you've got pedestrians on the pavement, making sure you're not too close. So you might need to move into primary position to maintain that distance between you and any pedestrians on the pavement. And obviously before you move into that position, you're going to check over your shoulder, your right shoulder, before you move out. Also, where you've got junctions, you can end up getting a little crowd of cyclists or waiting there, you know, if you're waiting for the lights to change or something like that. So you know, just thinking about that, making sure that you stop enough in advance and give the instruction to your child to stop enough in advance that you don't end up all bunched up together. Basic hygiene stuff, so washing your hands before or after a ride, and making sure that you sneeze into a tissue. You know, a lot of this is common sense stuff that everyone's going to know anyway, but staying at home if you're not feeling well. If you are going to overtake a cyclist, then don't overtake them too closely, so give them space, and then don't cut back in front of the cyclist too quickly, because then they'll be right in your slipstream. So you need to go a little bit further before you then move back in front of them. Think about your routes carefully, avoid the areas which you know are going to be busy or the times of day that are going to be busy. Towpaths at the moment are you know, not particularly recommended because it's impossible to pass people with any distance. You're going to be really close to people, but if it's first thing in the morning and it's quite early, then it could be okay. Always be prepared to give way and to have to move your position. So I was saying, you know, you might have to move into primary position. Sometimes where you've got an oncoming cyclist on these narrow roads, you might have to pull into a parking space to let them go past. So don't forget to do the looking and do the communicating. So check your left shoulder if you're going to move into a parking space, and let the cyclist know what you're going to be doing as well. And cycle within your limits. So, you know, it's probably not the time now to be experimenting and trying things, you know, pushing your child too far. You don't want to be having any kind of unnecessary injuries or accidents. So just think about that when it comes to your preparation and your route planning. So if you've got a child who doesn't know how to ride a bike yet, and this is something that you'd like to teach your child, and it is very doable for any of us to teach our own children how to ride a bike, there's a number of stages that you can follow, which generally works with most children. There's a really good video that I've put the link to there, which is made by Isla Roundtree, who's the founder of Isla Bikes. I think she just summarizes it really well and shows you each stage. So I'm not going to show it to you now, but if this is something that's relevant for you, you can watch the video. But the main stages of teaching a child how to ride a bike. So before they come to riding a pedal bike, it's great if they've had the opportunity to use a balance bike, because then they learn the skill of balance, which is you know, the kind of core skill to being able to then be able to progress to pedaling. So you ideally would have had lots of practice of that, and then once you get their first pedal bike, you then make that pedal bike into a balance bike by taking the pedals off. So you just need a 15mm spanner. You take the pedals off, you lower the saddle down to make that bike into a balance bike where they can put their feet flat on the floor and they can use their feet to push off. And it's a good idea to do that with the pedal bike, because then they get used to the feel of that particular bike and how it maneuvers, because all bikes will feel different depending on the weight. The brakes might work differently. So it's good for them to get the chance to be able to use it in that way, like a balance bike. So you get your child to push off using their feet while they're sitting on the saddle. And gradually you increase the momentum, and you're aiming to get them to lift their feet up to be able to glide for 10 seconds. Through this stage, you really want to make sure that they understand how to use their brakes. So you get them to practice that. You can get them to practice walking along with the bike and just squeezing the brakes and seeing, you know, how much you have to squeeze them to make it stop or slow down. And you know, you want to be really confident that they do understand how to stop before they start pedaling. Once they can glide along and they can get good momentum, feet up for 10 seconds, then you're ready to add the pedals. So put the pedals back on, get them to push off with their feet initially, and then to try and find the pedals, get their feet up onto the pedals and start pedaling. So a lot of children will be able to do this after a bit of practice. And once they can pedal, you know, once they can do it by pushing off and pedaling, then you can get them to practice where you actually set the pedal with your foot and you push away rather than using your feet, which that part can take a bit longer. I've found that quite a few kids have found that quite difficult to have that strength to be able to push away using the pedal, but you know, they'll get there soon enough. So a couple of tips for doing this is often parents think that it's good to do it on the grass because it's a softer landing if they're going to fall, but it's much more difficult to learn to ride a bike on the grass because you need to have the momentum, and on the grass with the resistance you're going to be a lot slower. So find a hard tarmac surface like a basketball court or a car park or something like that. Do short regular sessions. So some children will learn to ride a bike all in one session, but a lot of children won't. They you know, they'll need to have practice of each of the stages, and I've found that actually keeping it short is a good way to go about it, so because children can get frustrated if they're not getting it, and you know, you don't want it to become something that they feel negatively about. often if you just wait a couple of weeks, that can really help, and the next time you try it, maybe they'll get that thing that you were trying to teach them. And for some children, like they, you know, really struggling with the balancing or with the pedaling, then think about getting stabilizers, because the main thing is that you want your children to enjoy cycling, and being able to use stabilizers gives them a chance to be able to get out and ride their bike. So you can always take them off and try again with the balance bike and that approach later. And some children go from stabilizers to pedaling, so all children are different. It takes children different amounts of time to learn, and you know, that's fine. But roughly from somewhere from the age of like 3.5 to 4, that kind of age, a lot of children are ready to start learning to ride a bike, which seems really young, because I think like we probably all learned when we were a lot older. But you know, and you do see the really tiny ones who are like 2 or 2.5 who are pedaling, which is amazing. But yeah, just not pushing your child, if you know, waiting for them to be ready is good, so that it's something that they enjoy. And these are the resources that I mentioned. So the Bikeability website is brilliant. It's got lots of really useful videos and information for parents. There's also a website called Cyclists, which was started by a mum who's got a couple of children, and she's put together all in one place all the different topics relating to children and cycling. So she does reviews of different products, so whether it's child seats or different size of kids bikes, or accessories like helmets and clothing and that kind of thing, as well as tips for riding, you know, covering things like riding on the roads, or getting your children started with cycling. So that's a great resource as well. If you're on Facebook, there's the Family Cycling UK Facebook group. That's a brilliant, really inspiring group, which is got thousands of people from all around the UK who are doing lots of amazing cycling with their families, people from all different stages of starting to cycle with their families. So some are like doing cycle touring in different countries with their kids on bikes, and others are literally just starting out, and you can ask any question you want in there and you get really helpful responses. You can also look for products as well, so if you're looking for any particular equipment, you can often find people selling secondhand in there. Check your local council website to be able to book the bikeability lessons, get route ideas, and as I mentioned as well, you can on there you often also find family cycling groups where you can join with your family. So that's the end of my presentation. So is there any other questions that anybody would like to ask about any of those recent things I've just talked about, or anything else at all? I had one question that came in advance, which was about how to cycle with children and mixed abilities. So I think we sort of talked about it, but in case it's not clear, so where you've got one who, like, or kind of like my situation, where you've got one who is ready to ride on the roads and one who isn't really, it can be quite difficult to be looking at one on the pavement and looking at one on the road. You know, really you want all your attention to be in one place, and particularly if you're worrying about social distancing as well, and like, is your child on the pavement keeping away from people, or what are they doing on the pavement? So it can be a bit tricky, but it is also possible to do it. So you know, think about, it comes back to your route planning, trying to find routes which maybe enable you to cycle more together as a family. So off-road routes are really good, so like places like the marshes in Waltham Forest, where there's like some big wide paths, the wetlands as well, you can cycle through there, and you know, so minimize the bits where you're going to have to be, you know, you've got your attention split in 2 different places. Sometimes if it feels like it's getting a bit busy and you're not able to focus properly, then get the child on the road to get on the pavement, and you can walk on the pavement with them for that bit, and it just makes it a bit easier for you. But overall, like, you know, I think getting out with your kids is an amazing achievement. And you know, it's not necessarily going to be really smooth from the beginning. You're not going to all be on the road cycling together everywhere for your full route. It's going to be a bit yeah, as I was saying, like, be flexible, be prepared to get off, and just see every little bit that you do as a really great achievement, and a really great step that you're taking, being a positive role model for your child, seeing you cycling, you encouraging them to cycle as well and be active. So it's a really great thing that you're doing, and that you've come on the call today, and that you're interested in this topic. So if no one's got any other questions, then we can call it a day for now, but feel free to reach out to us, get in touch with us if anything else comes up. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and we've also got our website, cyclesisters.org.uk. This session's been recorded as well, so I'll share the link with all of you in case there's anything you wanted to go back to and have a look. You can do that. And I'm also going to send out a really short 2-minute feedback form, so I'd really appreciate if you're able to fill that out and just let us know what you found useful about the session, and any suggestions as well that you'd have if we run it again. So thanks very much everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.